HR leaders, what's on your mind these days? Is it AI? Is it the economy? The talent market? Remote work? Retention? DEI? Pay transparency? New laws? Our 2024 Workplace Trends Report outlines how HR leaders are thinking about these challenges and what they believe will help their organizations overcome them. Want to find out what they said? Head on over to peoplemanagingpeople.com/Workplace Trends 2024 and download the report to find out.
I think if you find yourself in a mode where we do have to change how we work, we're just not working well anymore. And you can point to attrition, great resignation, your attrition data, you can point to engagement, you can point to whatever you want. If you feel like we have to change how we're working in order to become a high performing company, you're going to have to take risks.
Welcome to the People Managing People podcast. We're on a mission to build a better world of work and to help you build happy and productive workplaces. I'm your host, Tim Reitzma, and today on the show, David Hanrahan, former CHRO at Eventbrite and an HR leader with over 18 years experience, and I talk about async work and how organizations can embrace this in the future of work. 3 things that you will learn when you listen to this podcast are experimentation, engagement, and where to start designing your organization for the future. David, welcome to the People Managing People podcast. How are things going today?
Tim, things are going great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to get into our conversation today just about, async work and in the future of work. It's something that, it's maybe it's an overused term or we talk about a lot. And yet when I'm talking to peers or people in, this work industry are still trying to figure out how to make it work. And so would love to hear from you and your experience and what you've done in the past. But before we get into that, I always have a couple questions that I love to ask people. One is, what does it mean to be a leader?
Well, I think leadership is a great responsibility. And I think as someone who has tried to be a servant leader, the leadership, sort of definition I have is someone who's in service to a team. And so that role, in my view, is not a command and control type of thing that people might associate leadership with in the past. But for me, in sort of the era that we're living in, it's a role to be a servant in service to others, make sure they have the information they need, the tools they need, the feedback, the direction, the sort of the hurdles, unblocked for them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think of a leader as really as a servant.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, just even that phrase, servant leadership, just resonates so much with me. It's not that, just if I'm a leader doesn't mean, hey, do as I say. It's, hey, I'm here to help. I'm here to guide you, to give you the tools, direction, feedback, and, feedback, whether it's positive or negative, but to help our teams excel. I think that's the essence. And it sounds like, we're pretty aligned on that.
Yeah. That's my view.
Yeah. And another question I love to ask is, we're at People Managing People, our purpose is to help build a better world of work. And when you hear that phrase, what comes to mind? Build a better world of work.
Well, if I think back to the long history of the science of management and industrial psychology and the sort of the evolution even of what we'll call the people function, maybe it used to be called HR or even personnel in the past. The question was, how do we think about work?
Yeah. When you hear that phrase, build a better world of work, I'm really just curious what comes to mind.
Well, I think, in this long history I was alluding to, we've really upended a lot of traditional concepts of management in the long sort of yearning to really unlock people's potential.
Mm-hmm.
And so the evolution of scientific management, for instance, Taylorism, where I'm going to sort of command and control, and I'm going to give you little, treats as you complete certain tasks, to now there's, I think, a realization that the more that we have empowered people, and that we're trying to help them unlock their potential, the greater that the individual can perform and the greater the teams can perform when they are empowered and they're individually and collectively unlocking their potential. And I think of that as, building a better world of work is really trying to find ways organizationally that we can unlock people's potential. hard to measure? What does that even mean? Is it intrinsic or extrinsic? I think that there's such a sort of pioneering, future there to unlock potential. And I
Hmm.
think of that. I think about, building a better world of work is really about unlocking potential.
Yeah, it is. And yeah, it's that big age old question of how do we do that? And I think there's a lot of ways we can do it. If we just think of leader, even tie back to leadership is more than just a command and control. It's really knowing, what are our teams good at? What are they passionate about? Where do they want to grow and learn, and creating space for that? Because we know if when we support our teams in that way, it just helps our companies. And if you're listening to this thinking like, how does it help my company? Well, happy motivated employees helps the bottom line. Simple as that. It does tie all the way even back into that financial metric. But even it ties in with our topic today, is this async, right? It's, hey everyone, we're now going from in an office synchronous work to asynchronous work. What I know at Eventbrite, when you were there, you played around with that and played it around and did some experimentation around it. So walk us through that. How did you go from that synchronous to asynchronous? And was it just a matter of sending off a Slack message or an email saying, hey, guess what? This is what we're doing?
Well, I would say that, whenever this is published, I guarantee you that inside the walls of Eventbrite, virtual walls, if you will, it's not yet complete, the experimentation. So I think the idea of experimentation as a mode has been one of the biggest unlocks for Eventbrite. Maybe in the past we said, hey, we just got to design this, document it, how, sort of hybrid work or async work is going to work for us. And then, done deal, we're done, to realizing that we're just never going to be finished with, finding the way that we should be working asynchronously, new practices, things that we need to abandon that are no longer working, things that we need to start doing. So a little bit of history. Eventbrite before the pandemic was about 97% in office. So a very small percentage of the workforce before the pandemic worked what I would call remotely, meaning they were working from home, not going into an office, far away from any of the Eventbrite offices. That's now changed. I think we're probably up to about a quarter of our workforce is nowhere near an office now. So, more than quadrupled in a very
Hmm.
short period of time, and just and no end in sight there. And we could talk about how that's been really beneficial. But through the past 2.5 years, I'd say early in the pandemic onward, we realized that just the way that we were going to work was going to be a thing of the past. The way that we used to work was sort of increasingly in our rearview mirror. We were not going to go back to an in-office culture, and we were going to really lean on choice. So, like a lot of companies, we debated, hey, when the pandemic ends, should we require people back for a certain period of time, 3 days per week? Should we go back fully to the office, or should we do something else? And so we made a choice that we're going to be really like leaning on choice. You choose where you want to work within some reasonable limits. Like we have to be able registered there to pay you, but you choose if you want to move from this stage to that stage, if you want to work in an office or not, your choice. And everyone in the company has that choice, no matter your role, your level, your function. And so from then that opened up a lot of conversations of like, okay, well, how is this going to work? What happens when, a team of 10, one person's in the office and the rest of them are all over the place. We're in a couple different countries with different languages spoken. So we're Spanish speaking countries in Argentina and Spain. We're in some English speaking countries like UK and Australia, Ireland, the US, obviously. And now we're entering into India. So, truly we're moving into more and more distributed. Async is going to be the thing that we have to lean on. And so I'd say probably right before we moved to India, we started to had some conversations with managers around what were they currently struggling with before we even opened up a whole new time zone. What were they currently struggling with, and what was working? So this became a program called Lead to Win, and it was essentially our leadership development program that we started in the middle of pandemic, over Zoom. And we didn't have all the answers. Really, the secret sauce here was just get all our managers in a room together, start talking, and capture the notes from those conversations. What was working for them and what was not working. And from then we started to develop some thesis that we need to test out through experiments. One of the things was that obviously that we were having, like, we're stretching the workday. So this is even before we moved into India. We heard in our engineering teams, as an example, some of the teams in Spain were having like 12-hour days. And we were having a hard time, grappling with that, having a hard time reining that in. This is kind of a long explanation, but that backed up by, and this is probably not just an Eventbrite phenomenon, the Microsoft research on their future of work stuff. They've released multiple versions of this, but Microsoft found that in general, since the start of the pandemic, people are in 2 to 2.5 times more meetings, and the workday is getting longer by about an hour. That's Microsoft, their research of everyone using their Teams product, which is like Zoom. And so we're like, wow, okay, we're not alone. The workday is getting longer. People are in more meetings, and we're about to get into a whole new time zone with engineers in India. This is going to be really hard. So let's start to experiment. Let's start to try and break up the old ways of working. One of the experiments that we ran was called Async Week. And we did a pre and post survey of all employees by function, by level. Are you a manager? Are you an IC? And we asked questions around, how well do you feel you're performing versus your potential? How productive do you feel you are? A series of questions just about sort of like, kind of their general engagement and how things are going. And then Async Week was no meetings the whole week, no internal meetings. So we would still have candidate meetings, obviously, but internally, if it's an internal meeting, you're just leaning on your Slack, Jamboards, GDocs, instant message, but we're not going to have any meetings. And then we assessed at the end of the week, the same questions. We asked the same questions. And in general, what we found was something pretty remarkable, which is that everyone felt that they were much more productive by not having meetings. Now, so productivity, like engagement, just sort of even connection within the team was strong, and managers and ICs scored favorably on this. And the key thing there is managers in general are in more meetings than ICs is what we found. So everyone pretty universally loved this. The one caveat I would say is like, we found that like there was a balance to strike. A whole week of async was hard for people towards the end. They're like, I just wish I could just talk to someone, and so maybe a couple of days here and there, but not a whole week. But in general, a really fantastic result. Now we've since done other experiments, including core working hours. So another experiment was let's compress all meetings in a week to just a 3-hour window. That is probably best for most time zones. So it prevents a situation where the team in Spain is like, it prevents them from like working late. It kind of like, it sort of keeps people into a reasonable time frame, and found similar results, both anecdotally and qualitatively. Like, wow, these new ways of working are yielding some promising results. So this is what we're just continuing to do, is run these experiments. And then for things that are working, we implement them. We implement them either at the organization level, so whole company, or we implement them in teams. If for whatever reason, like, hey, for this function, they really can work more asynchronously than other functions. We sort of bend it depending upon whether the function, prefers it more. So in any case, a long explanation, but experimentation mode is kind of what we've been leaning on.
Well, I like that right at the beginning, you talked about how you've pulled people together. What are your pain points? What's working, what's not working? Instead of, hey, just locking yourself and your team in an office, developing this whole strategy and presenting it to the organization and having it flop, but, getting curious, asking the right questions, doing the pre-survey, the post-survey on the experiment. And so, yeah, if anyone's listening and you're thinking, okay, how do we get this off the ground? Well, talk to your people. It's as simple as that, right? It's what's working, what's not working.
Talk to your people.
Yeah.
The one caveat is, I'd say, is that it hasn't, like, what's not been easy, I would say, is getting universal agreement to do the experiments. So, what happens is, okay, we're hearing that people are in too many meetings. The workday is getting longer, particularly for certain time zones. We're going to run an async week. And then behind the scenes, like it might sound on the podcast, like, oh, brilliant. Like everyone just like loved that idea. I'm assuming not at all. You get all this opposition. It's like, hey, this is a bad week to be doing that. Can we do it next week? And then these are people over here like, no, this is a bad week over here. Should it be 5 days? Should it be 4 days? Core working hours. Can we not do it in my team, please? Can you exempt us? Because we really don't think we have a problem in my team with this. So the idea of doing anything big org wide on changing the way that you work is going to encounter resistance. And it's like, the Ford quote, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And so a little bit of like the future of work is people, like you're going to have to, I think, take some risks. If you're in the role of like, I'm in this kind of future of work role here where being asked to, sort of design how we're going to work now in this weird new future, you're going to hit resistance. And I don't think of the goal as being like, like let's negotiate until we have like the most vanilla thing so that no one disagrees with this one experiment. You're probably not going to it's not going to result in anything game changing. And I think if you find yourself in a mode where like, we do have to change how we work, we're just not working well anymore. And you can point to attrition, great resignation, your attrition data, you can point to engagement, you can point to whatever you want. If you feel like we have to change how we're working in order to become a high performing company, you're going to have to take risks. And, behind the scenes, part of my exhaustion has just been that of the sort of like hitting the wall of like, okay, well, this is a brilliant idea, but no one's game for it. Or there's a lot of people game for it, but some key people are not.
Yeah.
I think my prediction for a lot of companies is shortening the work week from 5 days to 4 days, let's just say. Years from now, we'll be like, I can't even believe they debated that. Years from now, it's just going to be more commonplace, my prediction, that people are not working nearly as much as they are right now, because the data shows that working more hours doesn't yield greater productivity for the individual or the company. And so we already know, we have plenty of data to suggest that people could be like really unlocking more of their potential right now if we just organizationally put some more guardrails into how much that they work. And yet that the sort of the antithetical thing there is, if you're a C-suite position or you're a board, you're like, that doesn't sound good to the shareholders. That sounds like you're going to work less. I'm scared. I'm really scared of that. And so, that's one example of something I think more organizations should be leaning more into, and you're going to encounter resistance.
Yeah, there's always going to be resistance. I was talking to somebody recently, a senior people culture person just at a giant company, and she was talking about a new initiative, and everyone in the room, all the leaders were saying, this is great, but here's why it's not going to work. And just the resistance. And when I was talking with this person recently, it was just that exhaustion. As you said, it's what we need to embrace change. If we don't, I think our organizations are going to be left behind. I work at a small organization. People Manage People is part of an organization called Black and White Zebra. And in January, we got rid of work hours. Our CEO, our founder, said, hey, I don't want work hours. And so we talked about it from leadership, and it's like, oh, well, geez, like, what are we going to do? And we got to make sure people are working. And in my organization, we have seen productivity skyrocket. But we've also seen I feel like they're taken care of. Recently, somebody said, hey, it's Friday and I am burnt out. Like, okay, take the day off. My boss has said that to me numerous times. Like, I live on the west coast of British Columbia, and we love to be in the mountains in the winter. And he said, oh, it's a nice day tomorrow. You going snowshoeing? Like, oh, it's Tuesday. He said, yeah, it's Tuesday. Why aren't you doing that? Yeah. Because we know that when you set goals and good goals, where you're going with your organization. You have that sense of clarity. It helps drive. So if you're thinking about async and working asynchronously, or getting rid of work hours, or even going to 4 days a week, it's possible, but it's a bit more work on the front end of things. Man, the results I think are exponential. Would you agree with that?
100% agree. I think in our own small way, one little moving the ball forward over the past year, one more of our experiments was, what if we just took off the first Friday of every month, the whole company? What if we just took it off to just recharge? So literally, you're not allowed to work. You're not like, close your laptop. No one's emailing. CEO on down. Let's survey. Let's see what people think. So, sort of their engagement, their sort of their own sense of personal productivity versus their potential, so like lights out, one of the best decisions we ever made. And that was an experiment. And now we're doing it. Now we said, okay, that clearly did something for us, because in the qualitative and the quantitative data, it was just like lights out from like leaders, managers to ICs. Like, I'm so much more effective now because I know that's a day that we're going to take off. I can go recharge. People talk about like they went swimming in the North Sea and they had this idea that came to them because they were swimming in the North Sea on a day that we typically would work, but they're recharging.
Mm-hmm.
And so like breakthrough innovation, just like, okay, I finally got my head around this one problem. You're not supposed to be working, but yet people, when they like their job, when they feel like to your point, they're taken care of, the organization does things that helps them grow, helps them unlock their potential. They wind up just doing better. And like, like when you really like your job, sometimes just crack open your laptop at night and like, I'm just going to like, hey, I just thought of something. I'm going to write this down. Is that work? Or is that just sort of like you're doing something that you like? When you have work hours, when you have these legacy structures that are like, you got to work 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, are you really working? Or are you just part checked out? Because I have to put on the face of like, I've got my laptop open here. People see me online on Slack. The real like breakthroughs, the really like your really great performance is not coming from when you are expected to do something, but kind of when you were unexpected. It was just sort of like, hey, this is like protected time here. We're protecting time. Now I've got this breakthrough innovation that just happened.
Mm-hmm.
So anyways, kind of just your.
No, I think it just makes sense. And so I think of, but I also know that there's people listening to this podcast who are going, I don't know how we can make this work. Like we
Mhm.
need to be in the office, or we need to have these core work hours, or, I do like core work hours. I've worked in those environments, and they're extremely helpful when you cram everything into, it's like between this hour and these hours, this is when
Yeah.
we're going to set up meetings. And the rest of the time I'm heads down, getting work done.
Yeah.
And so when there's naysayers, right? How do we convince? I think that's the biggest thing is, we could show data, survey data like all day. We can show engagement data all day. But how do we actually drive that shift? Or if I'm just an IC in an organization and I want this in my organization, how do I drive that change?
It's a good question. And I think about separating like practices from philosophy. So an example would be, the idea of going to a 4-day work week or just work whatever you want, in let's just say an oil refinery. Because I used to work in an oil company where they do 12-hour shifts and they're working around reactors and they have to rely on people showing up, at certain times in order for the refinery to continue to run safely.
Hmm.
That's different. That's a completely different world. The practice might not scale at that company. So you have to find the practices that work for you in your industry. But the philosophy is we'll pin it back to empowerment, choice, finding through science how we're going to unlock people's potential in this industry, oil industry or tech industry. And what I mentioned at the top of the hour, servant leadership, the idea of thinking of my roles, I need to enable the best, like I need to create the best possible team. I need to enable them. The Air Force adopts servant leadership, right? So servant leadership, just as one philosophy, is not some sort of hokey thing that just a bunch of, California and, sort of northern Canada tech companies are doing. But it's actually like the philosophy there has found that like, wow, when we empower teams, we empower them and we give them more choice over their job, how they're going to work, the great things come from it. In the oil industry, they're one of the first to really experiment with self-directed work teams, where they're given more choice at the team level rather than having to always lean on a manual, for instance, to kind of to overcome certain problems. And so I think of that as the conversation. If this 4-day work week or whatever doesn't or the sort of work whenever you want doesn't work in our shift industry, in retail, in the oil industry, whatever, you can bring it back to the philosophy. And then, well, what, for us, in a retail world, what would empowerment look like? What would giving greater choice to our, our retail workers on the floor, who are helping customers? What would that look like for us? Might look like something different, but the philosophy is probably, cuts across those industries.
It's when you talk about just the retail industry or shift work industries, I remember hearing stories about Zappos, giving customer service reps a lot of choice in how they handle complaints or handle, customers who want to return things. And there's so many stories of those, it's not just a matter of, hey, I'm not being measured on, I have to do 200 phone calls in a day and each one has to be 30 seconds. It's
Hmm.
no, if I'm going to take 3 hours to be on a phone call because somebody's having a crisis, that's what I'm going to do because it's the right thing to do. And
Yeah.
so providing that choice, and I love that you brought in this, like, getting rid of the manual, so to speak, and having these self-directed teams and not saying like, okay, you have to move this here at this time. It's, well, if there's a better way to do it, I want to hear from you. And I think that's how we can continue to move to this idea of these async, but also, as you said, unlocking that potential. So what I'm hearing is it starts from that leadership and that direction. So it's on all the leaders.
It is. And I think what we've found, I think probably others have found, I think this is even backed up in some research, in async and hybrid environments, so much really leans on the leader creating an inclusive team. So regardless of my time zone, the leader understands what inclusion looks like. Very simple example. If you have a team where half of them are going back into the office and half are not, are we all logging into our Zoom? Or, is the 5 people in that one room, they're logging into their Zoom and they're talking with each other. And the 5 people that are on their Zooms are like, wait, crosstalk. I can't, what are you talking about? Inside joke. I didn't hear. So when the leader says, hey, no, we're all logging into Zoom, we're creating an equal environment here, even if 5 of us are in the same room together. So much relies on the leader to foster connection in that really distributed async mode, to foster inclusion, to have inclusive working practices, and to foster psychological safety, which, as Google found is a key ingredient for high performing teams. All of those really wind up being even more important in the async and the hybrid mode than perhaps when we were all just in a room together.
Yeah, I love those. I kind of summarize that into 3 points. Drive that inclusion in your team, right? And I've been there. I'm sure people listening have been there, where you've got one laptop or a camera at the very front of the room, and everyone looks, so tiny on the screen, and I'm sitting here in my home office and can't really hear what's going on, but I think there's something going on. And so being
Mm-hmm.
able to drive that inclusion, foster connection in async. And we recently launched a series about how to build a better world of work. And one of the interviews was talking about, hey, I'm remote, but I need to feel connected. I love my job, but if I don't feel connected, I might not stay.
Mm.
So I thought, that's a brilliant point. And then that psychological safety. I mean, that is reducing the fear in organizations and empowering people. And I
Mm.
think, and not just saying it, but actually living it, and
Yeah.
creating that safe environment. A safe environment isn't just a nice environment, but it's a place where you can share, you can get feedback, and not be afraid of getting that feedback.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think of those teams that have it right now, if you're listening and you're like, yeah, we got that, or we don't have that, it really is palpable when you think about the energy level in your virtual environment, where like we're sharing ideas with each other, like we're criticizing things like, hey, this is no longer working. And I feel comfortable like speaking up, and I've got a better idea. And my boss and the rest of my team members, like we have each other's back on this stuff. And it's energizing
Hmm.
because you don't know who's going to bring the next best idea. The conversations are going on in Slack. You almost kind of like, you don't miss the in office anymore because we've got psychological safety. So I think people who are worried about async, is like, man, at a certain point, the energy level just drops and you can never get it back. We got to get back in the office because the energy level is just not there. Has nothing to do with where you sit. I think it has more to do with those things like psychological safety, inclusion, and connection. And the thinking that we need to be in the office to get that again is this kind of legacy, thing that we're holding on to. And, but when you have it, it. It's like, it doesn't matter where I'm working. I could be on the beach. Like, I know we have this. It's like, it's super energizing.
Yeah. Yeah. I love it when a team member will just throw out an idea in our Slack channel, and then we just end up running with it. And it's
Yeah.
either becomes a new product or a whole new piece of content, or, hey, I actually don't like that. I think we misspoke here, so let's take that down. It's a safe space, and when you have that, I think magic happens, but also that drive of engagement. So it creates that space of, hey, we got each other's back because we know where we're going, right? Within our organizations, driving that clarity is so important. And I would say that's a kind of that foundation of async is, here's where we're going, here's what you're responsible for, and here's how we're going to measure success.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. And when you have it at the org level, it's also just like, it's gold, because you can log into the quarterly all hands and just know there's gonna be some good questions. Like, wow, who's going to ask that like tough question this time around? Because we've got psychological safety. We know that like people are not afraid to speak up and makes things more interesting. In
Mm-hmm.
an organization at the org level, when you don't have it, you just know all hands are going to be boring, because it's just going to be the show, the scripted show with no one asking any questions, no one's on the hot seat, and like we're not going to hear anything interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So, in any case,
Yeah. So one last thing, if somebody is listening to this podcast and going, okay, I'm headed to the office, or I'm just walking out to grab a coffee, and maybe struggling with this async, or this idea of going async, where do we start? What's the one thing we can do today to move towards this future of work?
it's a great question. I have to go back to the idea of experiments, and experiments don't have to be run at the whole org level. We can choose certain teams. Who's the one leader, who is interested in this? So maybe not all 7 of the C-suite members are interested in this, but one is, and I can lean on her, and we can do some experiments in Q2. And like, hey, what will be one thing, what new way of working that would make you really afraid, but you think would be interesting to explore in Q2? And
Mm-hmm.
we're gonna measure this. We're gonna ask a few clever questions, and we're gonna measure it. That for us was the real big unlock. Finding who are your champions, who's got you back. So you've got your tribe, if you will. You choose a time. You sit down, you have conversations with the leaders before you start doing anything, so you know what problem we're trying to solve for. So we're not just blindly trying to do things that we think are clever and cute. And then you measure it. And then for those things that work, what will wind up happening is, hey, I want to do that too in my team. Can we do that? Hey, let's have a conversation at the executive level. Maybe that's just something we should do for the whole company. But the idea of boiling the ocean probably prevents a lot of people from taking any step forward on async work and hybrid work. Whereas, you can tack it in small chunks first with people who got your back. And then it blossoms when you find something that is actually working.
I love that. It's just getting comfortable with the uncomfortable. But you got to start somewhere. You got to ask the questions and drive that culture forward. It's not just, HR's job to drive the culture, or the CEO's job to drive the culture. It's everyone in an organization, in my opinion. And so, if there is a better way, or a different way, or a challenging new way to work, have fun exploring it. It's part of the experiment. It might fail, but guess what? You've learned something. You'd much rather try something and fail and know it didn't work than to not try something at all and just wonder, what if?
Yeah. And make it fun.
Make it fun. Well, David, really enjoyed our conversation today. Thanks for coming on and taking the time out today. And for those who are listening, again, we'd always love your comments, your feedback. So please head to our website, peoplemanagingpeople.com, or drop me an email, tim@peoplemanagingpeople.com, or connect with us on social. We'd love to hear from you. So again, David, thanks again.
Thank you, Tim.